So resilience tends to be reified as the most comprehensive and effective response to adversity and trauma and pain in the human experience. In fact, resilience has been touted as the most necessary of skills, especially during the pandemic. By romanticizing or objectifying the importance of resilience, the problem that arises is that we focus on the limitation of human experience to basically do nothing less than try to be prepared for something that is worth listening to. Meaning, we can even look to ancient religious texts as the importance of pain. However, as humans, we are not good at trying to embrace pain as a necessary listening partner in our journey towards understanding the power of human limitations. However, even neuroscience doubts the efficiency of resilience. There is actually no direct scientific proof that demonstrates that there are any changes in the human brain when resilience is deployed or used. Many think that resilience is a muscle. However, if muscles are used, then neuroscience would show this particular skill being used, if at all. Psychologists define resilience as the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress, such as family, relationship problems, serious health problems, or workplace and financial stressors. That's the role of resilience. However, and this is the end of my introduction, I argue that resilience needs tragedy to be necessary. The very fact that we talk about resilience implies that we also need adversity for it to be useful. What we really need is to learn how to build the muscle of mapping out our own lives, businesses, relationships, and so on with the anticipation for tragedy, trauma, and stress. That means we need to expect it. We need to not wait for it and then deploy resilience. Some might think this is pessimistic, but in reality, rather than relying on something that brain science hasn't shown doesn't really exist in the brain, is to leave ourselves open to something we all experience throughout our whole lives. Now, there's also the argument that sometimes too much resilience can actually also be a bad thing, like too much muscle mass can be a bad thing, like putting a strain on your heart. There's actually large-scale scientific studies suggest that even adaptive competencies become maladaptive if taken to the extreme. And so my argument is that we actually don't need resilience. We need a map. We need a strategy that actually embraces pain as part of the human experience, that embraces loss and tragedy, whatever it might be, whether it be a business or a family, whatever the human experience is, that we need to actually get rid of resilience, because resilience does nothing, at least according to neuroscience. And so what we need is something way more robust than resilience, which has become nothing more than a fad today. So there's my intro. Would love everybody else's thoughts. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, this beautiful intro. Saloni, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's true that, the word resilience is all around us. Wherever we go, this is the word we hear, as if that's the only key to, bouncing back. But of late, I've also been reading more about this. It's not just about pain, trauma, grief, or, any setback, but it is about what do you do during that phase. So mentally, you are in a different state. So I was reading about intentionality, and that has helped me and my students also understand how to bring up an opportunity during adverse situations. So I thought I could possibly talk about that as an answer to if why resilience is not the answer.
Please.
I can elaborate on that a little later, maybe.
Jafar?
I've been hearing a lot about intentionality. I would love to hear, but I part agree and part disagree with George, but maybe because I haven't yet read up on it, right? So we talk about how initial stresses in our lives sort of lead to us being better prepared to handle worse situations later, right? And that means that when something bad happens, because some bit of it has happened before, you don't pay too much attention to it, and you pull yourself together sooner than later, right? And that process comes from experience. And where I agree with George is that everyone keeps talking about resilience, building resilience. How will you build
Bill.
resilience superficially, right? How would you, when it's happening so naturally and it's unique journey for everyone, every individual, how will you manufacture resilience? I don't get that point. I've never understood that. So yeah, that's where I agree.
So, George, my point of view, right? I mean, I did study stress at with quite a bit of detail because I worked on a project and tried to create a solution some years back, right? So, per se, I don't have a problem with stress, right? At least some form of fear kind of exists in human minds, right? And it's good to have stress. It's good to know how to deal with
Yes.
it and convert it into a good thing, right? But I think when you talk about resilience, you're talking about persistent stress, right? You're not talking of one-off stress, right? And there is no good science, right, that says that any persistent stress is good, right? And for two reasons, right? One, I think most often we don't recognize that we are stressed. Right? We kind of it takes a while to recognize that stress has happened, right? Unlike fear, where you know that you are scared very quickly, right? And it's got a action. Stress can take some months before you realize that you're stressed out of work or out of a boss or out of a bad situation or out of a marriage or whatever else, right? And human body has not been designed to deal with stress. It's been designed to deal with fear. Right? So the stress which creates all those chemicals in your body from cortisols to whatever else, right? I mean, it's physiologically harmful and it's emotionally harmful, right? So my suggestion to anybody saying what to do with stress is not manage it but to eliminate it, right? You have to get rid of stress, not saying I'll do yoga after feeling stressed to kind of find a way of managing it, right? So that part I get, right? But this human endeavor for dealing with failures, right? Being a little determined and dogged, right, is also an important part, right? And in many literature around resilience, right? I mean, the people who get mentioned the most are basically leaders, right? Saying how leaders are so thought to be like the resilient ones are the best, right? So those comments around if it doesn't kill you, it makes you better. So there's like a romanticizing, like a desired value, right? But we know that so many leaders, simply because of their doggedness, are the most stupid leaders that we find around ourselves, right? So I agree with you, but I don't know if we should get rid of it or we should just find a way of reducing it, right? And if we get rid of it, maybe we'll get rid of our determined, our determined self as well, which is not necessarily a great thing, right?
Yeah, I think what's very interesting is I actually like your definitions, Anurag, and I think what you expose is actually the importance of distinction. So for me, for example, I see that if you have resilience, you have to have trauma because the only time it's ever been deployed is that you need some sort of trauma. It's like saying, well, right only exists on its own without wrong. Well, no, right, it actually implies that there's wrong. So resilience implies that there's some sort of tragedy. And so, or some trauma or some pain or whatever it is. However, I think what you were explaining, which I think is beautiful, is what I would refer to, and I know this has been overused as well, so sorry, is post-traumatic growth. Whereas I honestly, when I hear both of those words, I hear actually that post-traumatic growth is the exact opposite of resilience. Because post-traumatic growth is not saying I am against pain, I'm against trauma. It's how can I learn from it? How can I grow from it? Whether that be psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, however you value it, it's literally actually looking at the importance of pain as a contributor to the human experience, not as something that we need to respond to and ultimately try to find a way to get rid of. And what's very interesting is they actually did a neuroscientific, I think it was like 8 years long, and they actually followed people over this 8-year span, and they were looking at the power of post-traumatic growth, where they had actually two test groups. And so one test group was, hey, when stress comes in your life, don't rename it, don't use the framing effect, don't look at it from a different angle. And then they followed another group of people who they said every single time you experience stress, every time, reframe it, call it growth, call it opportunity, call it something that is extremely different than what you're used to. Now, what they did is they actually went in and they tested the telomeres. Now, I don't know if you know much about the telomeres, but those are the caps on the end of our DNA. So as we get older, the telomeres start falling off and dying, and that's why we age. So what's very interesting is they actually did biological and neurological scientific research on these particular people who used the framing effect and reframed it as a positive experience. And for example, if you're nervous, they called it excitement rather than something else. And what happened is actually the telomeres got younger. So literally, ultimately reframing it, which I think is post-traumatic growth, not resilience, is actually quite powerful because it can actually help you live longer, according to all
Right.
of this research.
That's amazing. That's a good insight, George. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, the analogy is simple, right? That, if you drive your car on the worst road, doesn't make the car better, right? You're only
True.
kind of making it worse, right? The engine is dying, even if it's performing. Right? So, in general,
Yeah,
right? I
your
mean,
voice sometimes I don't get to hear you clearly.
I just got that message also. So, let me stop speaking and figure out my network while you. I want to
Now
hear
it's
about your
literally better.
intentionality, solution,
It's
Saloni.
better now, Anurag. In the past 5
Yeah,
years.
we
Yeah,
can hear
so
you better.
I was just saying one thing that I love the idea of persistence and stress and all in a physical situation, right? Because that's what it's designed for, right? And when it's not physical, right, as in a battlefield, it's good to be persistent and deal with stress and show some resilience, right? But not on a workplace desk, right, where you don't have any physicality to it. I think that's where stress is in its worst form, right, so to say.
Right. No, but for example, George said that you have to go through a phase of trauma, grief, to be able to understand, and that teaches you the most. But to be very honest, here is a pandemic which the whole globe is experiencing in a similar way. So yeah, then that is the time when people in our scriptures it has been said that you learn either by experiencing it yourself, anubhav, or if you experience it as an example, somebody else has gone through something and you learn from their example. So smriti, so anubhav and smriti are the two ways that one learns from, either going through it themselves or by following what others have gone through. So in that phase, when you have something of your own, all of us have our own backstories. It is not the same as yours. So how I have coped during pandemic is not the same as, let's say, Anurag has. So we both are individuals and we both have learned how to cope in this situation in a different way because our personalities are different, our philosophical bent of mind, our coping mechanisms are different. And so that is the time when I started reading more about intentionality, and I realized that resilience was a very overused word. What was it actually trying to say? So then I realized that when there's something like pandemic, when be it a businessman, be it an ordinary housewife, everyone was going through a similar experience. So at that time, but before you actually face it yourself, can you also think of, what if I get hit by something like this? How do I kind of organize myself, prepare myself, and in the mental state that I'm in, can I come out with something more positive? So even entrepreneurial journey must have seen many mushroom during the last 1 year. That is a good example of intentionality, that if there is a situation like this which is going to stay for at least a year or two or more, why should I succumb to it? Why can't I make good use of and seek more opportunities and stay more relevant and alive, with my whatever that I can do? So that's the basic understanding of intentionality, to be ready with certain, preparations and seek proper guidance and try and either bounce back in the way wherever you are, or look at something, something new for yourself, but not crash at any point of time. So that's also a big decision that an individual has to take, or as a group, they have to take, that no matter covid, but we will do something, if not what we are doing right now, but something definitely. So that's what I thought that we could take up more discussions on this gradually.
Guys, there is an interesting question in the chat, right? Is from Christine. Is
Yes.
this leaning towards anti-fragility, right? And any thoughts on resilience versus anti-fragile, right? So I know it's like a three-circle discussion, but any quick comments?
Very
Well,
important
I would
question.
say, especially post traumatic growth, you're actually embracing fragility. It's not against fragility. Whereas I think resilience is almost saying I need to actually build the muscle. The only way that I can build the muscle, and resilience implies that I need to actually go almost seek out trauma. Whereas post-traumatic growth says, hey, trauma is going to happen and pain is going to happen and we're going to experience it, but it really does come down to our perspective. And the neuroscience shows that it actually has health benefits. Not
We
again when we
become
go
more
seek it out.
accepting, right?
Yeah.
We become more accepting of the fact that each one of us would be a little. We need all of us to be, more accepting of each other's situation, and that's exactly what you're trying to say, George. So I truly support your point of view.
Yes.
But what about context, right, George? So, I mean, when we talk about resilience and is that a solution, right? Um, don't you think that context to context it should be different, right? And there should be a place for resilience and extreme resilience in certain contexts because it doesn't really harm your emotional self and physical self in a way that in some other context resilience can do, right? I mean, unnecessary resilience can do, right? So the Marines, right, and the armed forces, right? I mean, isn't resilience good for them, right? Even in a very extreme case, right? I mean, while for us, not grieving, the death of loved ones in COVID is unnecessary resilience, right? But for armed forces, isn't resilience a good thing, right? Because it really doesn't harm them.
Yeah, and I mean maybe we're talking about definition again. I mean for me, I guess what would be better is if you're a company or an individual or whatever the context is that you would have a map or a strategy that says, listen, we don't know when this is going to happen, but we know something's going to happen. We know a tragedy is going to befall us. We know a housing crisis is going to befall our company. We know that someone's going to die in our family. We know that those things are going to happen. So rather than denying it, because I think as a human species, we like to deny pain. We like to deny trauma rather than kind of understand that there's an entangled nature to pain, that there's an entangled nature to trauma. Again, not seeking it out intentionally, but literally saying, hey, I've got a map of my life. And I don't mean map like here, I'm turning left here tomorrow and I'm turning right here the next day, but more, less cartoonish than that, but more kind of a realistic understanding and less because I think sometimes resilience is kind of like I have what it takes, right? I mean, that's the more kind of almost like life coachy way of saying it. You have what it takes. Well, here's the thing. If neuroscience shows that resilience doesn't really actually change anything in the brain, well, of course we already have it. So then that means it's inherent to who we are. We don't have to go out and seek it. We don't have to build the muscle. We don't have to do the 5 steps that are seeming so prominently pushed on like places like social media. Here's your 3 steps. Here's your 5 steps. Here's your like the commodification of resilience. But really what we need to come to is creating a map of expectation and saying, listen, I'm not going out and seeking this out, but I know it's going to happen. And so when that happens, what's my strategy? What's my map? What's my response rather than resilience,
So George, you just said commodification of resilience, and that has actually encouraged a new profession in itself during the last 1 year, with so many people coming up with solutions to different organizations, especially the smaller ones, the new ones, the startups. They tend to get carried away by the word, and they tend to get into this. I mean, I'm just asking, what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's partly what I really, really struggle with is when we turn, especially what could be deemed a mental health experience into a commodification, right? And we get these certificates and we almost kind of pervert what it means to be human. And we're trying to use these really fad-like or kitschy or really popularized terms to then make money off of other people's experiences. That's where I have a massive issue. And that's somebody who's a psychologist, right? And so, social psychologist. And so I have a massive, massive issue with that. Yeah, but I mean, I think what you just said is 100% correct.
Are we looking at CROs now, Chief Resilience Officers, something like that?
Yeah, we need one from Mentza now, right?
Some other ways that this is being dealt with is also this whole self-affirmations and self-love affirmations, right? I don't know if what do you guys think about that? I mean, they're also trying to use that to push resilience into it. And then I think someone had this question. I think Priyanka could the pressure to rationalize, narrate, put pressure to ignore a trauma, could resilience sort of
Yeah, I
in long
wanted to
time
take that up
backfire in
too.
the long term?
Go ahead, Saloni.
Yeah, I was also reading the same, Jafar. Could the pressure to we are talking about pressure and not to ignore trauma, which is true. Now everybody's like, I read an article on grief also recently by Mr. Abhijit Bhaduri, and interestingly, our organizations have to learn how to now talk about grief and trauma. At least we should be aware as an individual not to come up with our stories as a sob story or a self pity kind of thing, which may happen and is happening also. So the concern is definitely that maybe soon we'll be thinking, okay, we have also gone through it, and you too. So what about compassion? We are talking about compassion equally, loud nowadays. So I still think that as an organization, we do understand empathy or compassion, but at the same time we should also be still aware and conscious of the fact that we all have gone through a lot, and we need to be mindful of how to treat our people accordingly.
Saloni, interestingly, right, that grief conversation happened on Mentza also,
Hmm.
led by Abhijit Bhaduri, right? And
Hmm.
I forget the name of the lady who was on the circle the other day, right? And she made a very interesting point, right? And I think both you and George spoke about awareness and then kind of bringing it to the fore, right? And she was making a point around how some of these things, like pain, right, experiencing pain and kind of grieving and so on and so forth, is a social thing, right? And it
Hmm.
cannot remain individualistic, right? Because that means only more stress, right? So how do you create a social permissiveness and social acceptance for such narratives and such awarenesses and such fragilities at time, right? Is part of the ecosystem building that's required, right, to
Hmm.
really move away from this fad of resilience, if that makes sense.
Mhm. I think somebody has to draw that point very clearly, that as an organization, I'm not talking about the individual, but as an organization, we also have a DNA. So somewhere a lot of thinking has to go in that now.
Any closing comments, George? We have a minute and a half.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's going to be easy, but I agree with you, Solani. I think we need to come to a place where we're actually willing enough to challenge at least the commodification of resilience,
Hmm.
and to be able to come to a point where we normalize the reality that as a species, as a human species, as a human community, we will always be dealing with pain. And that's not some pessimism. I'm not saying go out and